Okay, so now we're going to get into the evolutionary ascent, the rise of our species. And we're going to do it in a couple sections. We're going to look first in the evolution of life, and then we're going to eventually look specifically at the evolution of humans from apes. So beginning with the evolution of life, let's give ourselves a quick overview. So I want you to look at this piece on the left here. I think it's especially useful. What you'll see is first the Earth being formed, of course, 4.5 billion years ago. The emergence of water, the emergence of single-celled life. So notice that the life came after water. Water seems to have been essential for the emergence of life and has consistently been symbolically associated with life. Something that is alive is very wet. Something that is dead will gradually lose all of its water. So then the single-celled organisms, which we'll look at a little bit, single-celled organisms are come forward, and then they will start to create oxygen with photosynthesis. And so once oxygen is starting to build up in the atmosphere, we're paving the ground for a entirely new experience, a new couple breakthroughs. So then you're going to see the earliest multicellular life, which is interesting. Now you're going to start to see how individual cells, which seem to have thus far existed on their own, begin to band together. And you can look at some really interesting stuff like slime molds, where you see these single-cell organisms that function with an intelligence that surpasses even the most advanced city planners. So then we're going to see the rise of fungi, the rise of sexual reproduction, and then finally, after the rise of sexual reproduction, which happened before we split into plants, animals, we saw with sexual reproduction, we see the beginning of extreme variability and variation. And this is going to be a huge explosion, set up a huge explosion in acceleration and evolution. Then the earliest plants, the earliest animals, and then we're going to talk about the Cambrian explosion. Incredibly exciting. The Cambrian explosion is where the eye comes forward. It's where the spinal cord and the chordates come forward. It's where we start to see solid body parts. Really huge breakthrough, the Cambrian explosion. And then finally, the rise of the dinosaurs, which we're not going to really talk about today, mammals, we won't talk about very much, and then finally, primates and humans. And you see how small our existence is in this timeline, which is one of the core recurring conversations around human evolution. We are just a tiny little blip, and not just the history of the universe, but also a tiny little blip in the history of evolution. And even civilization, the existence of civilization, is a tiny little blip in our own history. Okay, so let's start the roller coaster. Life. Where did life start? We believe life started in these vents, in hot vents at the bottom of oceans. And we wonder if life could even be existing or coming to be in the same way at the bottom of moons like Europa, that we believe may have these thermal vents. So these thermal vents are churning basically prebiotic material. This means material that's not yet defined as living, but these materials are starting to be driven together by heat and by exchanges. And so this seems to have been one of the things that drove early creation of the biological materials. So we like to say that life formed in vents, but it's really kind of, it may be a little bit fuzzier than we imagine. It might not be just a voila moment, there is life, because we see over time this aggregating, this gathering of material. And so, for example, we've started to wonder if life could have possibly, if genetic material may have actually relied on periods of freezing. So we think of the primordial soup as one of the places where life starts to come into existence, and I'll encourage you to check that out a little bit. But also, it's possible that when ice freezes, it will push all the residues. It freezes more pure, and so it pushes what is not ice out of itself and into what become these kind of cracks or ridges, or almost like vesicles. And so it seems possible that some of the genetic material was pushed together by the freezing of ice. So this is one of many processes and that was responsible for creating the materials, the building blocks that would ever start to emerge as life. But this sets up an important question. I'd like us to think about it. This is a great debate, a rising debate. Is life rare? Is basically the universe cold, dead, freezing, and in need of some kind of rare spark to create life? Or is life kind of wanting to happen badly all the time, everywhere? Kind of like it is on Earth. You almost can't fight it back. Life just, keeps growing forward. This takes us to a deeper question of, is consciousness emergent, or is consciousness an embedded principle in all things? Generally, mainstream physicists are uncomfortable with anything involving consciousness. So are neuroscientists. Consciousness involves free will, and free will challenges the entire paradigm of determinism, this paradigm that everything is scientifically explainable. So physicists, for example, instead of saying that there can be free will or the divine will, they're more comfortable saying that there are infinite universes. That way, instead of saying that the free will is chosen between this potential universe and this potential universe, instead, it's more comfortable to say, well, all the universes exist and we just happen to be in one of them. That solves the free will problem. No free will problem at all. So there's a huge aversion to the idea of soul, spirit, life itself, consciousness itself, when we're studying evolution, when we're studying physics. So this is a question that will remain open probably for a good part of our lifetime and challenged. Is consciousness emergent, or is there something about consciousness that's fundamental? Is life rare, or does life want to happen all the time? I suspect that we will, in our lifetime, get some answers, and we'll go to the places we expect to find life on Mars and on Europa, and we may find it. And if we do, this may confirm this notion that life wants to happen. So as we talk about the emergence of life, there are a couple other things we should talk about. So what is the goal of evolution? What is the goal of life? Now, you and I might have profound ideas where life is the vessel of experience in which we can have all types of profound and meaningful experiences. But for biologists, the purpose of life is more life. This is the single variable that we're using to try and make sense of why things have evolved a certain way. And so this may or may not be entirely accurate, but the paradigm is to ask a question: how did this step in evolution help to perpetuate the species? That's the Occam's razor. How did this step perpetuate the species? Which means that we're looking at how many offspring and how fit is that offspring. This is the main thing we're trying to figure out. How did life of this particular species perpetuate itself? How did this breakthrough or that breakthrough support its perpetuation? So let's dig in. Okay, so after the first beginning of life, we move on to the first single-celled organisms. And I'll encourage you to do some deep dive on that I'll share with you. But one of the main things I want us to recognize is with the rise of the single-celled organism, we have a lot of the main breakthroughs that we think of in terms of life. We already start to recognize mortality. Things can be born and things can die. We already recognize the idea of a solid boundary or a distinct boundary of self, right? So there's a cell wall, there's the inner and the outer. We already begin this huge effort of consumption. We have to eat to stay alive. And then also procreation, the capacity and seeming will to procreate. So a lot of what we think of as life, as the drives of life, a lot of the things that drive us today are still the same things that drove the first single-celled organisms. The experience of self as an isolated entity in separation from the world with this cell wall, with our skin, the experience of mortality, the struggle to stay alive, then the corresponding need to consume. and then again to procreate. So these are essential metaphors, essential foundations to the way that we live, something I hope that y'all will consider thinking about as concepts, experiences, perspectives that have existed since our ancestors that were single-celled organisms. Now keep this in the back of your mind. You descend from cells. Your parent wanted you to exist. They procreated, and now you are continuing their lineage. Well, this lineage is unbroken all the way back to the first life. Your parent is a product of their parent, is a product of their parent. And this goes back not just to the origins of our species, but beyond the origins of our species. You know this, it's just really crazy to think about, and I want to make sure you do think about it. We go back to the earliest mammals. We go back and back and back until we're fish, and back and back and back until we're single-celled organisms. A single-celled organism wanting to procreate, wanting to continue its existence, wanting to have a child. That child wanting to have a child, wanting to have a child, that child wanting to have a child, that child wanting to have a child, until all the way until today. It's kind of radical when you think about it. And this, when you think about your parents' psychology and how we inherit our parents' thoughts and the way that they see the world, this would have gone all the way back to the single-celled organisms. We inherited a modality. We have, to this day, inherited a modality that already began cultivating, already began developing with the single-celled organisms. The need to consume, the experience of ourself as separate. We think of Western individualism. How about single-celled organisms? So we experience ourselves as separate. We need to consume. We struggle to stay alive, and we procreate. So asexual reproduction, you know about it. You've mitosis, of course, the splitting of the cell, the cloning. And then we move into meiosis and sexual reproduction. And with sexual reproduction, we get a few major breakthroughs. First of all, sexual reproduction, by splitting in half and then combining halves to make a new whole, we create incredible variation. We accelerate variation considerably. And with the acceleration of variation of genetics, right? Variation of types, right? So in order to have some type of change in a single-celled mitosis-oriented organism, it will require some type of mutation. Now remember, where does mutation come from? How do we achieve mutation? Remember, one of the number one influencers or creators of mutation, we believe, is cosmic rays. The absolute essence, the innermost place of our DNA is changed, transformed by cosmic rays. Okay, so the acceleration of evolution with variation, but also one thing that's kind of been a wonder is, so if only the female can have offspring and the male cannot, now you've reduced the species' ability to procreate at pace. So this might be seen from a very reductive way as a disadvantage in evolution. So why would you do that? Why would you all of a sudden have half of the population procreate when it could have been both with hermaphroditic and asexual reproduction? Well, we believe that the species that are the result of variation, this increased variation, are more fit. They're more successful in the world. They have more diversity of genes, not just as an individual, but as a collective when confronting various challenges. So we find that with more variation, more variability, we can take on more disasters, more challenges, more infection. And this is why, by the way, we find it so important to create biodiversity. So right now we have made it a habit to create the ultimate corn. But that puts us at a risk, right? Because now we're relying on that one type of corn to succeed. And if there was some type of disease or some type of challenge for that corn, we'd be majorly set back. So the variation, the biodiversity is something that we've started to recognize a little bit later, a little bit more recently, as very important. And that biodiversity, when it comes to agriculture, and that biodiversity has also been essential for getting over various hurdles in the long journey of evolution. So one thing that's super interesting is that these eukaryotes seem to be the common ancestor to plants, animal, and fungi. So I think that's especially interesting to imagine that we actually descend, we share an ancestor with plants, with fungi. And that's why we have comparable sexual reproduction. And this is why the sexual reproduction of plants and animals and fungi is so has such potential for metaphor, for our own projection, for our own sexual reproduction, right? So what is it for a human to flower? For a human to flower, that means to go through puberty and to achieve sexual maturity. Fruit, offspring, of course, seeds. These are consistent. These are shared with us. And this is one of the things that we learn in the Garden of Eden. Really incredible that we learn this in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, the Garden of Eden seems to be very much about the insight of the Garden of Eden seems to very much be about the recognition that we are comparable to the tree. To pluck the fruit is to separate the baby from the umbilical cord, right? The stem, the umbilical cord, separation. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as they say, which is a funny saying because apples are very interesting. Every apple is a totally different apple tree. If you want the same apple, you have to graft an apple, whatever. That's aside. The point is that we learned in the Garden of Eden, we started to make this story represents, and many stories represent, early stories represent the birth of knowledge kind of stuff. This recognition that we share this cyclical pattern with the seasons, with the plants, with the tree, with the fruit, with the grain, whatever it is that we're projecting upon. We are recognizing that, oh, we also are cut down like grain and go into the earth and then are hopefully resurrected. So that's a projection onto grain because we want to see project not just our own life and death, but this secondary life, this secondary resurrection. So either way, this projection of human reproduction and human growth and our cycles onto plant cycles may actually be in part the result of the fact that we share a common ancestor. And so we actually do share common biology when it comes to sexual reproduction. One really interesting theory that is still being considered that I find kind of really odd and maybe worth considering is that the Geodachian, which is a Russian theory of sex, suggests that the splitting off of the X and the Y chromosome was done for an interesting reason, that the Y chromosome, the male chromosome, was kind of more experimental. Like, we'll have this solid X. Okay, this is the good stuff. This is the things we want to make sure we perpetuate. But I want to try a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And the Y chromosome, it is suggested, the male, is responsible for these more experimental developments. And these more experimental developments seem to be the argument for it is that men die more, that we die from disease easier, we take bigger risks, and this may be a kind of natural drive to expand the range of our species as a whole, so that we can find ourselves into new niches, new abilities, new places, new capacities that can enable us to do more as a species over a longer period of time. It's an interesting idea. Contemplate a little bit if you like. And just remember that as we give rise to sexual procreation, we also give rise to the whole nature of selecting. Now that there is sexual reproduction, now there is selection. And so it's possible that this has taken off one of the speed limits of evolution, because now we're going to pick. It's not just, okay, we're going to procreate which one of the species, which one of this new species, the one with the mutation or not, will succeed. We'll see how it goes in the world, right? And then some come, some go. But what if you had a mate that could say, oh, definitely that's a stronger skill. I want that. I'm going to mate with that, right? So now you can accelerate the adoption. It's not just who lives and dies. It's who gets selected. And the selection can very rapidly shift towards those who have changed, those with valuable mutations for the collective. And this is something you see, right? Actually, I designed a music video for this musician that was something like this, where I'll leave it a little bit undisclosed who this was, so I can say how I really feel. The song was a little bit, well, it was about a guy stealing another guy's girlfriend. And it was kind of not, in my opinion, on my level of metaphorical and spiritual, mystical value. And I needed it to be interested in it. So what I ultimately did is I played with the story and turned it into an allegory, so that he's talking about this kind of like trying to steal this woman away, and this woman that doesn't want this other guy. And I turned it into this story of something like Lysistrata. And this is the story, I think I mentioned it last time. Spike Lee did a adaptation of it, where the women just decided that they weren't going to have sex with men that they didn't like. They're just, husbands, you're being a bunch of jerks, over, done, right? So in the story, that's basically what I set up, was this notion that there may be changes in modern men. We've seen a lot of recognition of toxic men, and we've seen a lot of recognition of toxic masculinity. Well, wouldn't it be a thing if women just said, not choosing that anymore, just 100%, just we're not going to go with dudes that do that kind of stuff, that aren't compassionate, aren't caring, aren't considerate? Then there could be a near overnight switch away from a certain type of male. That's what the music video is about. But that's something that comes to be when you start talking about sexual reproduction, which brings in attraction. Okay, the Cambrian explosion. How exciting. This is when the eye comes to be. This is when, which is incredible, because all this time you have very slow development of senses and feeling, and now all of a sudden the opening of the eye. Incredible. And the eye, by the way, I'll point you towards another deep dive on it, but it seems to have been just basically touch cells started to become sensitive to light. And then over time, of course, more and more sensitive. So with the Cambrian explosion, we have the first hard body parts. We have the first shells. And we believe, and by the way, because we have these shells, they preserve much better in the mud. And so we have a much more complete record from this time onward. Now, why did we have hard body parts at this time? We believe that it's because there had been finally so much oxygen had been created and put into the air that now these processes that require a lot of oxygen could come into being. And one of those processes was the creation of these harder materials of collagen. And so it's possible that the first body parts are really the product of increased oxygen. Also, we see the first chordates, which is the beginning of the nerve column. This is what will eventually give rise to the vertebrates. All of us descend from chordates. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second as well. Anthropoids, giant shrimp, which you see in this picture, and the rise of the first sponges. So 530 million years ago, as it goes, a lot of the species, a lot of the phylum, a lot of the major breakthroughs that are essential to us today seem to have taken hold. The first eye, the first hard body parts, the first spinal column. Well, at the time, a cord, nerve cord, dorsal cord. And then the rise of this eye, as we're talking about. We talked about it just a second, that this is when touch becomes light sensitive. And one of the things I think is always fun to talk about is the rise of the pineal gland. So well before the eye was this pineal gland, this proto-eye. What is the pineal gland? The pineal gland sits in the very center of our head, in the very center of our brain. The lobes are so fine that Descartes argued that there were no lobes. He thought it was the only non-bifurcated part of the brain. Descartes actually believed it was the seat of the soul. And it's been argued by others that it is the third eye. Either way, this part of the brain, the pineal gland, 1000% is light sensitive. And it seems to be that some of species that do not yet have eyes do have pineal glands that have evolved profoundly. And it seems, we believe, that the pineal gland is the foundation, gave us a foundation for the emergence of the eye. But what is the big difference between the eye and the pineal gland, and what does the pineal gland do today that's different than what the eyes do? So the eyes developed a lens. So the pineal gland can receive light. It's sensitive to light. So if you're in a room of red, it feels it. Green, it feels it. Actually can even differentiate between some different colors, and it will turn the light into chemicals. So actually, most famously, most centrally, it turns serotonin, which is one of the most active neurotransmitters, modulators. It turns serotonin into melatonin. Melatonin, you've heard about it, you might have even taken it before, helps you sleep. By the way, melatonin will help your body sleep. It is a chemical created by the pineal gland to help your body sleep. It, however, is too big of a molecule to pass what they call the blood-brain barrier. So when you eat melatonin, it will help your body sleep, but it will not get into your brain. The molecule is too big. But when the pineal gland creates melatonin, it is spread throughout your brain and body, and the melatonin will start putting your body down. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about melatonin is that the amount of melatonin we create is a product of the amount of light that the pineal gland receives. So it actually uses light to translate serotonin into melatonin. It's part of the engine. It's basically the energy going into the system. And so that means that the pineal gland is light sensitive, but that also means that it's creating more melatonin in the summer and less melatonin in the winter. So now the pineal gland starts to become a foundation for what we call circadian rhythms. And we start to latch on all kinds of interesting habits and patterns and processes, from shedding and hibernation to puberty, all start to become attached to the rhythms, the circadian rhythms, procreation rhythms. So the pineal gland as a foundation is essential for these circadian rhythms. So with the emergence of the sensitivity to light also meant the beginning of the emergence to sensitivity to the rhythms, to our life's rhythms in relation to this light. And then finally, we'll put on this pineal gland as it emerges into the eyes, the lens. And the lens will concentrate the light and filter the light. And so the lens is what focuses the light to the point where we can see very specific things. Of course, there are some different, there are more differences as well, the sensitivity, rod cells, cone cells, and all that stuff. But the big difference is that light is focused for the eye, whereas for the pineal gland, it receives light in a more field-like way, is sensitive to light fields. Okay, the centralization of intelligence. So now we go from the with the emergence of the nerve, following basically the first single cell organisms, single cells start to turn into nerve cells. Huge breakthrough, nerve cells. Now nerve cells at first are evenly distributed in a kind of grid. Cool. Now, first of all, a nerve cell is a cell that's able to achieve what we call an action potential. Action potential is basically kind of like you create enough charge until, boom, a big burst of charge, right? It sets up for other parts, other experiences that we have. So this first action potential, first nerves are distributed in a kind of grid, but then you're going to see this grid start to aggregate into circles, into loops. So now you're going to start to have loops. Huge. You see this in like starfish and that kind of thing. Squid. So now these loops are going to start to turn into chords. And these chords are going to eventually become a spine, a central nervous system. So you start with the nerve, then the nerve is equally distributed, then the nerve starts to specialize into kind of circles, into loops, and then these loops start to create chords. And as these chords happen, the centralization of the nervous system, the next major step will be what we call cephalization. So now once you have created the centralization of the nervous system around the spinal column, now we've got to grow the brain on the top of it. And so you're going to have more and more and more nerves move to this brain area that will now just control the rest of, will be the center of control for the rest of the nervous system. So we call this, so first you have the creation of the nerve, the neuron, the coming together into consistent loops, the creation of a column, and then finally the birth of the brain. This is all a process of centralization. So now we are taking all of the senses, all the experience of the whole body, and we're trying to create a central command, just like the Central Intelligence Agency, right? This is central intelligence. This is an effort to create a common command center with all the information. Really profound. And this is something I hope you guys, as you start to make sense of the steps that you're going to tell, I hope that you will recognize the poetry and the analogies. Okay, and this brings us to our next step, and we'll leave it here with the dawn of humanity. So again, let me just take us back, quick run through. We've gone through the rise of single cell, first of all, of life itself and the vents, mixing together, using the heat to mix together these materials that will eventually create genetic material that will eventually create the first life. Then the rise of the single-celled organism, rise of the multi-celled organism, rise of sexual reproduction, the earliest plants, animals, finally this Cambrian explosion where the eye comes on, where the spinal cord comes on, or at least the nerve cord, and where you start to get hard body parts. This is going to give rise later to the further development of the eye and the further development of the nervous system. And as we look at the eye, we see that the eye is something that has evolved to become increasingly sensitive and has eventually added this. It's given us a foundation for the circadian rhythms in our relationship with light that come seasonally and maybe even monthly with the moon as well. And then we also have, this also will continue until we put a lens over the sensation of light, the sensing of light, until we can focus as a result of that lens. Something that should be familiar to filmmakers, of course. And then we look at the nervous system, the nervous system's trajectory, where we start with these nerves that start to form these circuits, that start to form these cords, that start to eventually form a brain on top of that cord. And so now that we've reached the brain, now we can move on to the history and evolution of humans. So with that, we'll get into the rise of man, the rise of Homo, in the next piece.